The photographs happened the way photographs always happen when you're not performing for them. She was laughing at something Sandra had said. Something about the man in the neighboring box who had been loudly explaining each race to his companion with the unearned authority of someone who had watched YouTube videos. And the hat was tipped very slightly. And the light was doing that honey-colored thing it had been doing all afternoon. And she was entirely herself for one unwatched, unguarded moment. She didn't know about the photographs until the car ride home. Sandra, scrolling through her phone somewhere past the services, said, "You're on Twitter." "I know I'm not on Twitter." "You are now." Sandra turned the phone. "Well, someone who spotted you is." The image was better than Carol would have predicted. The hat was sharp against the sky. Her posture was, she assessed it honestly, good. She looked like a woman who was having a day she chose to have. The caption read, "Spotted at Cheltenham. Carol Middleton turning heads in what looks like Princess Catherine's Philip Tracy. That hat is doing everything right." Woman's hat 400 retweets. More appearing as she watched. Carol said. "You look brilliant." "It's Catherine's hat. We've established that." Sandra put the phone down. "You still look brilliant." Carol set her head back against the seat. Outside, the motorway unreeled in the dark, the lights of other cars drawing orange lines across the window. She thought about what Evelyn had said. A borrowed hat sits differently. She thought about Catherine in July, sunburned across the nose, laughing about something James had done, setting a hatbox on a hall table, and walking through to the garden without looking back. Whether that was forgetting or choosing. She thought it was choosing. The thing people didn't understand, couldn't understand, from the outside, with all the photographs and the speculation and the constant low-frequency noise of public interest, was that the Middleton family had remained, at its essential core, entirely ordinary in the ways that mattered. Not in circumstances. Obviously not in circumstances. But in the texture of it. The Sunday texts. The WhatsApp threads that ran at 11 o'clock at night about absolutely nothing important. The way her children still called her mom with the exact inflection they'd had at 7 years old when they wanted something. The borrowed hat on the hall table. The voice note that ended with a laugh she hadn't planned. "Can I borrow something of yours?" a daughter asks her mother. Except she doesn't ask, she leaves it behind, because some things are offered through absence rather than request. Because a mother knows how to read that. Because 30 years of reading that child has made Carol fluent in the language of what Catherine doesn't quite say. She needed something of her daughter's today. She wouldn't have said it in those words. But, standing in front of the wardrobe at 7:30, still in her dressing gown, one hand on the door frame, she needed to carry something of Catherine into the day with her. Her daughter, who had had a year that would have flattened most people. Who had not been flattened. Who had, in fact, been. Carol searched for the word, lying in the dark of the car, and found it, galvanized. As if everything had been stripped back to exactly what she was made of, and what she was made of had surprised even people who loved her, who knew her, who'd watched her do her first cartwheel in the back garden, and packed her off to school on the first morning, and sat in the front row at Westminster Abbey, and held themselves very still. The hat had sat on the top shelf for 8 months. She'd been keeping it safe. She was home by 9. The house was quiet. That specific quality of quiet that houses have when they have been loved in for long enough, when the silence is thick with accumulated years rather than empty of them. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table. She did not check her phone again. She thought about Evelyn, and her rust-colored hat, and 31 years of coming back to a place because something essential had happened there. Not the proposal in the car park. The coming back. The choosing, year after year, to stand at the rail with 30,000 strangers and feel the ground shake when something beautiful and powerful decided to run. She thought about what her father used to say at Cheltenham, watching the horses circle in the parade ring before the Gold Cup, every year without fail. You can tell the ones who want to win. It's in how they walk. She had been watching Catherine walk for 30 years. She knew what wanting something looked like. The hatbox went back on the top shelf that night. But she folded a note inside the tissue paper, in her own handwriting, on the small note card she kept in the kitchen drawer for precisely this kind of impulse. Wore it to Cheltenham. It turned heads, as expected. "I'll get it back to you soon, or whenever you want it. No rush." It kept me good company. "Love, Mom." She paused. Added P.S. "You've become quite extraordinary. I suspect you already know. I wanted to say it anyway." She closed the box. She put it back. She went to bed and slept the way you sleep after a day that gave you something you didn't know you needed. Deeply, and without complications, and with the particular peace of having worn something well. Nobody screamed. That surprised her later when she thought about it. There were 63 people in that building, and when William and Catherine walked through the main doors, no announcement, just walked in, the room went to a kind of silence that had texture to it, like the air changed weight. Then, from the craft circle, said quite clearly, "Oh my lord," which broke it. The noise that followed was not screaming, precisely. It was more like 63 people all exhaling at the same moment, and then, immediately trying to speak to each other, and not quite managing it. Someone knocked over a chair. The DJ cousin, who had been setting up in the corner, stood holding a cable with his mouth open. Catherine laughed. Not a polished, public laugh. A real one. The kind that happens when something genuinely surprises you, and your face doesn't have time to arrange itself. She turned to William and said something quiet, and he smiled. One of those smiles that reaches before the face catches up. They moved through the room the way Margaret had always found interesting about people who are genuinely good at this. Not working it, not performing warmth, just present. Actually present. Catherine crouched down almost immediately to talk to a small girl who was standing next to her mother with her fist in her mouth, and her eyes enormous. She didn't talk down, didn't use the voice. She just asked the girl's name, and listened like the answer was the most interesting thing in the room. Margaret stood to one side and watched. She'd spent 20 years watching this building. She knew what it looked like when people were really seen versus when they were managed. She knew the difference between a smile that was for the room and one that was for the person in front of you. She'd gotten very good at reading it. These two were for the people in front of them. A member of the communications team approached Margaret quietly. Explained the schedule. 45 minutes. A brief tour. Time to meet some of the program participants. A moment at the end with the anniversary cake, if that would be welcome. Margaret said yes, that would be lovely. And her voice came out completely normal, which she was proud of. William came to her first. He'd been working his way around the room, and she watched him shake hands, and lean in to hear things over the noise, and laugh twice at things that Margaret, from a distance, couldn't catch. Then, he was in front of her, and he was taller than she'd thought, though she wasn't sure why she'd thought differently. And he put out his hand and said, "You're Margaret. You started all of this." Not a question. He knew. Someone had briefed him, and he'd actually absorbed it. "I started it," she said. "These people kept it going." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a very good answer. It's a true one." He smiled at that. "We read about what you've built here. 200 visitors a week, the food bank expansion, the intergenerational program." He paused. "The quilting circle." "The quilting circle," she confirmed, "is a force of nature." "So I've heard." He glanced toward the craft circle table, where Dot and 5 of her companions were sitting very upright with the concentrated casualness of people who are trying extremely hard to appear as if they are not staring. "I've been told to be afraid of it." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. "You should be." She made the cake. He laughed, and it was genuine, and across the room Dot pressed both hands over her mouth and turned to the woman beside her. Catherine reached Margaret 20 minutes later. She'd been in the Mother Ann toddler room, which was separated by a thin partition, and Margaret could hear through the wall the rising and falling of children's voices, and then Catherine's, easy and low, and then laughter. Actual children laughing, which wasn't a sound you could fake out of anyone under 5. When she came back through, she had paint on her left sleeve. Yellow paint, from the look of it. "There was a situation," she said to Margaret, with a look at the paint that was pure exasperated affection. "There's always a situation in that room. I was informed the painting was a horse." Catherine considered. "I chose to believe it." Margaret smiled. She hadn't planned to say what she said next. It came out of somewhere she hadn't checked first. "My husband would have loved today. He used to sit in that back corner and do the crossword while I ran everything, pretending not to watch." She stopped. She hadn't talked about Terry to anyone but Priya in 2 years. "Sorry. I don't know why I don't apologize." Catherine's voice had shifted. Not softer exactly. More direct. Like she'd stepped slightly closer without moving. "How long ago did you lose him?" 17 years. "And you kept going." It was keep going or stop, and stopping didn't make sense. Catherine looked at her for a moment, not with pity, which Margaret had learned to spot, and hate, but with something that recognized it. Just that. Recognized it. "The intergenerational program," Catherine said. "The one that pairs the elderly residents with the young people for skill sharing. That was your idea." "Priya's, actually." "Then, Priya should be very proud of herself." She paused. "And so should the person who hired Priya." Margaret didn't say anything. She looked at the floor for a moment. The old carpet. The one they'd been trying to replace for 3 years. When she looked up, she was composed. Mostly. By the time they gathered around the cake, the room had become a different kind of place. It happens sometimes, in buildings like this. Some combination of people and time and something that doesn't quite have a name, where the occasion outgrows its own planning. It wasn't loud anymore, it was warm. The kind of warm that has nothing to do with the heating. People were sitting on chairs they'd pulled into clusters, and Priya was talking to one of the communications staff with the focused intensity of someone having a career-changing conversation. And the DJ cousin had somehow ended up teaching one of the protection officers the chorus to a song that Margaret didn't recognize. Dot's cake was magnificent. It really was. 3 tiers of slightly uneven Victoria sponge with buttercream roses that could generously be called interpretive, and across the top in careful icing. Sunridge, 20 years, thank you. Catherine stood in front of it for a long moment. Dot, she said, turning around. This is extraordinary. Dot, who had survived 30 years of shift work and raised 4 children and once told a local counselor exactly what she thought of his parking policy, went the color of a Victoria sponge herself. It leaned a bit in the heat, she said. I did warn Margaret. It's perfect, Catherine said. And she meant it. And everyone knew she meant it. And Dot pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. William was standing near the window with 2 of the teenagers from the after-school program. Margaret drifted close enough to catch the tail end of it. He was looking at their collage, the one made of photographs, and he'd stopped at something in the middle. One of the older photos. He leaned closer. Who's this? He asked. The boy standing next to him, Marcus, 15, who Margaret knew had been coming to Sunridge since he was 7 because his mum needed the food bank, and then kept coming because he liked the chess club, and now ran the chess club. Looked at the photograph. That's Margaret, he said. When she started it. Someone found it in a box. Margaret didn't know the photo was there. She hadn't seen it. She looked at it now from 3 feet away and recognized herself, 20 years younger, standing in the church hall, laughing at something out of frame, holding a box of donated books. She didn't remember someone taking it. She didn't remember being that person who didn't know yet what this place would become, who didn't know yet how many years it would take, and how many cups of tea, and how much grief and hope and Tuesday mornings. William looked up from the collage, found her across the room. He didn't say anything, just nodded once. She nodded back. The speeches were short, which she was grateful for. William spoke for 3 minutes. He talked about what community actually means, not in the abstract policy way she'd heard 100 times, but in the specific way, the warm room, the cup of tea, the fact that someone noticed when you stopped coming and came to find you. He said that Sunridge was a proof of something the country needed to be reminded of regularly. He said that the people in this room had built something that would outlast all of them. He looked at Margaret when he said it. Not obviously, just briefly. She held it together. Then, he said something about the cake, and the room laughed, and she held it together through that too. Catherine spoke after him. Just 2 minutes. She talked about the mother and toddler room, the horse painting, the paint on her sleeve, and 3 mothers in the front row lit up like they'd been given something they hadn't known to ask for. Then, she said, quietly, that she hoped the people who ran places like this, the Margarets, the Priyas, the Dots, understood that what they did was not small. That it was, in many ways, the most important work there was. That showing up, every Tuesday, for 20 years, was not nothing. It is so far from nothing, she said. The room was very quiet. Priya, behind Margaret, made a small sound that she immediately covered with a cough. Margaret didn't look at her. She stared at the cake. The 3 tiers. The interpretive roses. Thank you and Dot's careful icing. Something cracked open in the middle of her chest, and she breathed through it slowly and did not cry. She absolutely did not cry. She had not cried in this building in 20 years, and she was not going to start now in front of everyone she'd ever worked with, and also 2 members of the royal family, and the DJ cousin. She breathed. Held it. Held it. When she looked up, Catherine was watching her. Not with pity. With that same recognition from earlier. The thing that looked at you and found the real version, not the put-together one, and held it without making it smaller or larger than it was. Margaret took another breath. Then, Dot said, are we cutting this cake or aren't we? And the room exhaled, and someone started clapping, and the DJ cousin played something loud, and the moment folded itself up quietly, and went somewhere safe. They were gone by 12:15. Quiet exit, the way they'd come. Cars pulling out of the car park while inside. 63 people processed what had just happened in the chaotic, joyful way of people who'd been given something to feel and weren't quite sure what to do with it yet. Margaret stood at the window again. Different from this morning. Priya came and stood beside her. Said nothing for a while. She had paint on her sleeve. Priya finally said, "Yellow." She didn't try to hide it. No. Another silence. Outside, a pigeon landed on the car park wall and looked at nothing. 17 years, Priya said quietly. She'd been close enough to hear. Margaret didn't answer. She picked up the cold tea from the windowsill. Put it down again. He would have loved it, she said. He absolutely would have. Priya didn't say anything. She just reached over and took Margaret's hand and held it for a moment. And Margaret let her. And outside the car park was just a car park again. And inside the main hall, Dot was cutting cake into 37 pieces and arguing cheerfully about whether the icing roses counted as equal shares. And someone was laughing. And the DJ cousin was playing something gentle now, something that asked nothing of anyone. The building held all of it, the way it always had, the way it would for 20 more years, probably, if Margaret had anything to say about it, which she did. She always did.